She'd left her wedding ring on the bathroom counter before her shower. Not lost, not misplaced. Set down, the way you set down something you've decided you won't be needing for a while. I noticed it an hour before she left for the studio that night. I didn't say anything. I picked it up after she'd gone, turned it once between my fingers, and put it back exactly where I'd found it. Something about the way it caught the light next to her toothbrush made my chest go tight in a way I didn't have a name for yet. I told myself she just didn't want to lose it dancing. I told myself a lot of things that week, and every single one of them was easier than the truth. My name is William. I'm 42. I've spent the last 16 years designing buildings other people get to live in. And for 14 of those years I was married to a woman named Elena, the kind of marriage people used to point to and say those two are fine. Aren't they lucky? We had 2 kids, Grace, 11, and Owen, 7, and a house on a quiet street off Rutledge Avenue that Elena had picked out herself, back when picking things out together still felt like the whole point of being married. That night, she was at the studio she'd opened 4 years earlier, a ballroom dance school in a converted warehouse near the river, teaching a Thursday class that ran late more often than it used to. I didn't think much of the late nights at first. Elena had wanted the studio for years before she finally opened it, and I'd been the one telling her to go for it, the one who believed in it maybe more than I believed in anything of my own by that point. I was proud of her. I still am, if I'm honest. Even now, that part never really left. What I remember most about the early months of that studio wasn't suspicion. It was relief, if anything, relief that she had something that was only hers, something that lit her up in a way our kitchen table conversations hadn't in a while. I didn't examine that thought too closely. I don't examine things too closely in general. It's not really how I'm built. If something's wrong in a room, I'll notice the temperature change before I'll ask anyone what happened, and I'll usually just open a window instead of asking. That's probably the first thing you should know about me, if you're going to understand the rest of this. I don't fight. I never have. Growing up, my parents fought loudly and often, and I decided somewhere around 12 years old that I would never be a person who raised his voice in his own house. I kept that promise to myself for 4 decades. I'm not sure anymore whether it was a virtue or just a very elaborate way of hiding. Elena used to tease me about it. Early on, you'd apologize to a chair if you bumped into it, and I'd laugh, because it was true, and because it seemed like a small, harmless kind of true. It didn't seem harmless the year the studio schedule started swallowing our Thursdays, then our Tuesdays, then most of a given week. I noticed. I didn't ask. The night with the ring, she came home a little after 11, hair still damp at the temples, smelling like someone else's cologne underneath her own perfume. Something cedar and something. Nothing like the clean, floral thing she usually wore. I was still awake, reading in bed with the lamp on, and she came in already talking, already narrating her evening before I'd asked a single question. A story about a student who kept counting out loud in the wrong meter, funny in the telling, warm in the delivery. I laughed at the right places. I always laughed at the right places. I looked at her hand as she talked. The ring was back on. I hadn't heard her go into the bathroom. She caught me looking, and, for just a second, less than a second, really, if I'm being precise about it, something moved behind her eyes that wasn't part of the story she was telling. Then it was gone, and she was asking about Owen's spelling test, and the moment folded itself back into the ordinary shape of our evening like it had never happened at all. I didn't ask her why the ring had come off. I didn't ask about the cologne. I turned off the lamp instead, the way I always turn things off instead of asking about them. And I lay there in the dark listening to her breathing even out beside me, wondering, quietly, privately, in the part of my mind I never let out into the room, how many other nights there had been exactly like this one, small and unremarkable and full of something I'd chosen not to look at. I didn't know it yet, but that ring on the bathroom counter wasn't the last thing she'd set down without telling me why, and the next one wouldn't be nearly as easy to put back. We had a rhythm, back then, the kind that looks fine from the outside because it never stops moving. Grace had swim practice on Mondays and Wednesdays. Owen had a reading log I signed every night without really reading what he'd written. I left for the office at 7:30, came home by 6 most days, and Elena's schedule at the studio had quietly expanded to fill whatever hours were left in a week. Tuesday evenings, Thursday evenings, and now, increasingly, Saturday mornings for what she called competition prep, though she'd never once mentioned entering a competition herself. I noticed the studio schedule before I noticed anything else. I told myself that was just the business growing. Dinner most nights was the four of us and a lot of noise. Owen narrating his day in exhausting detail. Grace rolling her eyes at both of us with the specific contempt only an 11-year-old can produce. Elena would come in halfway through sometimes, still in her dance clothes, kiss the top of Owen's head, and eat standing at the counter because she said sitting down made her stiffen up before a late class. I never questioned why a woman who taught dance for a living needed to stay limber for teaching a beginner's foxtrot to retirees on a Tuesday night. I should have. There was a night in early spring when she came home and went straight to the shower before dinner, which she'd never done before. Always ate first, showered after. That was the order of things in our house for 14 years. I stood in the kitchen listening to the water run and felt something shift in my chest that I couldn't name yet, and I did what I always did with feelings like that. I opened the fridge and started making dinner and didn't think about it, or told myself I wasn't thinking about it, which amounts to the same thing if you do it long enough. She started keeping her phone face down on the counter around then too. Small thing. I noticed it the way you notice a picture frame that's been moved 2 inches to the left. Not wrong exactly, just different enough to catch on something in you before you can name what. I didn't ask her about the phone. I didn't ask about the showers. What I did instead, and I've turned this over so many times since that I could probably draw you a diagram of the exact shape of my own avoidance, was start working later myself. If she wasn't going to be home until 7, I found reasons to stay at the office until 7:15. If she took a Saturday morning for prep, I took the kids to the hardware store and told myself we were bonding. I matched her absence with my own, instead of asking her what was filling hers. Grace noticed things before I let myself. She asked me once, completely out of nowhere, over cereal on a Sunday, whether Mom still liked dancing with Dad, the way she used to at Grace's cousin's wedding 2 years back. I laughed and said of course, and changed the subject to her homework, and only later that day did it occur to me that an 11-year-old had asked a more honest question than I'd managed to ask my own wife in months. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever caught your own kid noticing something you trained yourself not to see, you know exactly the particular kind of shame that sits behind your ribs afterward, quiet and completely useless, because it doesn't make you say anything either. I didn't say anything. I finished my coffee and drove Grace to swim practice and let the moment close over the way I let everything close over that spring. The studio's front window had a big framed photo from Elena's opening night. Her and me, cutting a ribbon, both of us laughing at something out of frame. I passed it every time I picked up the kids from a lesson, and one evening in April I noticed someone had taken it down. In its place was a newer photo, a group shot from a showcase, Elena front and center, a man I didn't recognize standing close beside her with his hand resting easily at the small of her back, the kind of easy you only get from repetition. I stood in the little lobby for a long moment looking at it, waiting rooms of parents and preteens moving around me, and felt the same tightness in my chest I'd felt looking at that ring on the bathroom counter. I asked the receptionist, casually, who the man in the photo was. "Oh, that's Marco," she said, not looking up from her phone. "He's amazing. Elena says he's the best partner she's ever danced with." I said something normal back, I don't remember what, and went to find Owen in the changing room. I didn't ask Elena about it that night either. I told myself there was a version of this where it was completely nothing, and I chose, deliberately, to believe I was living in that version. I didn't know it yet, but I just walked past the first piece of evidence that would matter, hung in a frame at eye level, in a lobby I stood in twice a week, and I'd let it hang there for another 6 months before I let myself really look at it. I found out about Marco's name from a receptionist before I ever heard it from Elena, and once I had it, I started hearing it everywhere, the way you learn a word and suddenly see it printed on every page you turn to. She mentioned him in passing over dinner, an offhand comment about how Marco thinks we should enter the regional showcase this fall, and I watched her say his name the way you'd watch someone handle something fragile, careful not to let it show how much weight it was actually carrying. I asked, as neutrally as I could manage, how long he'd been teaching at the studio. "Since January," she said. "He's really good. Genuinely one of the best partners I've danced with." She said it too fast, the way you say something you've rehearsed saying casually. I let it go. I always let it go. That's the thread running through everything I'm telling you, and I'm not proud of it, but I'd rather you understand it than not. Confrontation, in my house growing up, meant slammed doors and my mother crying in the car in the driveway for 20 minutes before she'd come back inside. I built my whole adult personality around never being the reason for that kind of scene. What I didn't understand yet was that silence has its own kind of violence. It just moves slower. There was a Tuesday that spring when Elena came home early, genuinely early, 6:15, unheard of for a Tuesday, and seemed almost giddy about it, talking fast, offering to help with dinner, complimenting Owen's terrible drawing of a dinosaur like it belonged in a gallery. I remember thinking, at the time, that this was a good sign. Look, I told myself, nothing's wrong. She's happy. She's here. It didn't occur to me until much later that a woman who is truly fine doesn't usually need to perform being fine quite that hard. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the part of the story that still catches in my throat a little when I tell it. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from watching someone you love work very hard to convince you everything's normal. You don't know yet that it's a performance. You just know something in the room doesn't sit right, and you don't have the language for it. And so you sit there and eat dinner and compliment a dinosaur drawing and let the wrongness pass through you without catching on anything. Then I go back to the dinosaur drawing, still on our fridge as I'm telling you this, years later, and it doesn't feel like a happy memory anymore. It feels like a photograph of a moment I misread completely. Grace asked her own question again around then, a different one this time. She wanted to know why Mom's phone had a passcode now, when it never used to. Elena laughed it off. Something about grown-up privacy, said lightly, the kind of lightness that's doing a lot of work to hold something down. I watched Grace's face when she said it. My daughter, 11 years old, had a better read on the room than I did. I told myself I'd talk to Elena about it later. I didn't. I want to be honest about something else here, because it's not a flattering part of this. For a stretch of a few weeks, I convinced myself the studio itself was the problem. Money, not Marco. I'd seen the books once, months back, helping her with a spreadsheet, and the studio had been bleeding cash for most of that year, barely staying afloat on class fees and Elena's own savings. I built an entire theory around that. She's stressed about money. She's distracted because the business might fail. That's what the late nights are. That's what the passcode is. She doesn't want me seeing how bad the numbers have gotten because she doesn't want to admit the thing she built might not work. I actually felt relieved landing on that explanation. It was a problem I understood, one that didn't require me to ask her a question I was afraid of the answer to. I even offered, one night, to help her look at the studio's finances again, thinking I was being supportive. She said she had it handled, a little too quickly, and I let that answer close the subject the way I let everything close a subject. It took me another 2 weeks and one specific lie to understand I'd built my theory on the wrong foundation entirely. She told me, on a Thursday, that the studio was hosting an out-of-town instructor for a weekend intensive, and she'd need to help chaperone a group trip to a competition 2 hours south. And overnight, just her and 2 students, and, she mentioned almost as an afterthought, Marco, since he was certified to judge the junior division. I said that sounded fine. I meant it. I had no reason yet not to. I found out 3 weeks later, from a text that flashed across her phone screen while she was in the shower. A text from a number saved only as M, thanking her for last weekend, with a string of words I won't repeat here because I don't think they're mine to repeat, that there had been no other students on that trip. There had been no competition. There had been an overnight, and there had been Marco, and there had been nothing else. I stood in our bedroom holding her phone in my hand, the shower still running down the hall, and I didn't feel the tightness in my chest this time. I felt something colder than that. Something closer to certainty finally arriving after months of circling. I put the phone back exactly where it had been lying, face down, the way she always left it now. I didn't say anything that night either, the old habit dying hard, even here, even now. I didn't know it yet, but the lie about that weekend wasn't the last one I'd catch her in. It was only the first one I could actually prove. I didn't confront her that week. I told myself I needed to be certain, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that certainty felt safer than a conversation I didn't know how to start. What I did instead was start paying attention the way I should have been paying attention for months. I pulled up our shared banking app, the one we'd both used for years to split groceries and the mortgage, and went back through 6 months of charges I'd never once looked at closely. There was a recurring charge to a boutique hotel 40 minutes north, always on a Thursday, always the same modest amount, filed under a category she'd labeled studio supplies. I sat with my laptop open on the kitchen table long after she'd gone to bed, scrolling back through months of studio supplies that added up to more than our property tax bill. I photographed the statement. I didn't say anything to her the next morning either. Dana, the receptionist at the studio, called me the following week. Not about Elena directly, she was careful about that, but to ask if I could pick up Owen's dance shoes he'd left behind after a father-daughter class months back, something she'd apparently been meaning to mention for a while. I went to get them on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew Elena had a private lesson booked. Dana handed me the shoes, and then, almost without meaning to, mentioned that Marco had put in for a few weeks off starting in June, some family thing down in Savannah, she said, then added, quieter, glancing toward the studio floor. Elena's been weird about it. Snappy. Not like her. I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether Elena and Marco worked together often. They co-teach the intermediate class, Dana said, and they've been doing a lot of the private lessons together lately. Elena says it's for the showcase. She paused, and something in her face shifted, the look of someone deciding whether to say more. I probably shouldn't say anything else. It's not really my business. I told her I understood. I didn't push. That was its own kind of mistake. I'd later learned Dana had been sitting on more than she let on that day, the kind of thing a good friend keeps to herself until it can't be kept anymore. I want to be honest about a moment here that I'm not proud of. 2 days after talking to Dana, I opened Elena's laptop while she was in the shower. Hers, not mine, something I had never once done in 14 years of marriage, looking for an email confirmation for that hotel. I found it in under a minute, a reservation under her name for that coming Thursday. Same hotel, same modest amount. A room booked for 2 nights instead of the usual one. I closed the laptop. I put it back at exactly the angle she'd left it. And then I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time, listening to the water running down the hall, feeling something I can only describe now as a strange, quiet grief. Not for what I'd just found, which I'd already half known, but for the version of myself who used to trust without checking, who was gone now and wasn't coming back no matter what happened next. She told me, much later, what was happening on her end that same week. She didn't know I'd been in her laptop, didn't know about the hotel statement I'd already photographed. This is what she was living through, in her own words, the way she told it to me afterward. I knew I was running out of road. Marco had started talking about June like it was a real decision point, stay or don't, and if I stayed, what that actually meant. I remember standing in the studio parking lot before that Thursday, engine off, just sitting there, telling myself this was the last one. I told myself that probably 4 times already, and each time I half believed it while I was saying it. I kept thinking about Owen's spelling test on the fridge, how I hadn't asked him about it in weeks, how I couldn't remember the last time I'd really looked at anything in that house instead of just moving through it. I booked the second night anyway. I don't have a clean explanation for why. I just know that by then I wasn't choosing Marco so much as I was choosing to not go home yet, to whatever version of myself was waiting there. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Not the parking lot. Not the 4 false last times. Not the fact that some small part of her was already grieving something before I ever confronted her with anything. What I did instead, that same week, was drive up to the hotel myself on the Thursday in question, without telling her, and park across the street for 40 minutes before I made myself leave without going in. I told myself I was gathering more information. What I was actually doing was standing at the edge of something and still, even then, hoping I'd find a reason to turn around and pretend none of it was real. I didn't go in. I drove home, sat with Grace while she did her homework, and answered Owen's questions about dinosaurs like everything in our house was exactly the way it had always been. I had what I needed by that point. The statement, the reservation, Dana's half-finished sentence, my own eyes on that parking lot. I still hadn't said a word to Elena. I told myself I was still deciding how to approach it. I wasn't deciding anything. I was standing at the edge of the last quiet week our marriage would ever have, and some part of me, the part that had spent 42 years avoiding rooms exactly like the one I was about to walk into, was trying to make it last as long as it possibly could. I didn't know it yet, but I wouldn't get to choose when that week ended. Elena would end it for me, for days later, in a way neither of us saw coming. Thursday came, and I still hadn't said a word to her. I told myself, driving home from work that evening, that I'd wait one more day, gather myself, find the right sentence. I never got the chance to use whatever sentence I was building. She was standing in the kitchen when I walked in, no coat on, no overnight bag by the door, her phone face up on the counter for the first time in months. Her eyes were already red. "I canceled the trip," she said, before I'd even set my keys down. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in the doorway, still holding my keys, waiting to understand what I was walking into. "I know you know," she said. "Dana told me you came by. She said you asked about Marco." She stopped, pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth for a second. "I opened my laptop this morning, and the read receipt on the hotel confirmation said you'd viewed it 4 days ago. I've been sitting with that all day. I couldn't get in the car tonight. I couldn't do it. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes over a room in a moment like that. I don't know how else to describe it except that the air itself seemed to stop moving." I set my keys down on the counter, very carefully, like the sound of them landing might break something that hadn't broken yet. "Say it," I said. My voice came out flatter than I expected. "Don't tell me what I already found out on my own. Say it." She was crying by then, not performing it, just crying, the kind that comes out ugly and involuntary. "His name is Marco. It's been going on since February. I'm so sorry, William. I am so sorry, I don't." And then something happened that I still can't fully explain, even now. I laughed. It wasn't cruelty. It came up out of me before I had any say in it at all. A short, disbelieving bark of a laugh. The sound of something finally finding the only door left open to it. Elena flinched like I'd struck her, which in a way, I suppose, I had. "February," I said, once I could talk again. "You know what I did in February? I helped you build a marketing spreadsheet for that showcase. I sat at our kitchen table until midnight fixing your formulas so the numbers would work out in your favor." I wasn't shouting. My voice had gone somewhere colder than shouting. "I've been apologizing to a chair for 42 years, Elena. I finally understand what that actually cost me." She came around the counter then, reaching for my hands, and I let her take them for exactly as long as it took me to understand I didn't want them held. "Please," she said. "Please don't do this standing up. Please just sit down and let me explain. I'll tell you everything. I'll tell you all of it." "I don't need you to explain it standing up or sitting down," I said. "I need you to understand that I already know more than you think I do." I pulled my hands back, gently, which somehow felt crueler than if I'd yanked them away. "I know about the hotel. I know it wasn't your first time there. I sat in a parking lot across the street from it last Thursday for 40 minutes deciding whether I even wanted to know for sure." Her face changed at that, something beyond the crying, something closer to horror. "You were there?" "I didn't go in," I said. "I couldn't make myself do it. I drove home and helped Owen with his dinosaur homework instead." I heard my own voice crack slightly on that sentence and hated it. That's who I am, apparently. A man who'd rather help his son draw a stegosaurus than find out for certain his wife is in a hotel room with somebody else. "William." She was on her knees now, actually on her knees on our kitchen floor, hands pressed together like she was praying to me. "I will do anything. I will end it tonight. I'll call him right now if you want. I'll quit the studio. I'll do whatever you need me to do. Just please don't leave. Please, I can't lose you and the kids. I can't." I looked down at her, my wife of 14 years, kneeling on the floor of the kitchen she'd picked out herself, begging me not to leave a marriage she'd already left months ago in every way that mattered. And I felt something crystallize in me that I don't think I'd ever felt before in my life. Not rage, exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than rage. "Get up," I said. "You don't have to do that. Please just talk to me." "I am talking to you," I said. "I'm telling you to get up off the floor." She got up, slowly, and stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, waiting for whatever I was going to say next, waiting for the anger she probably thought she deserved and might have understood better than what she actually got, which was a kind of stillness she'd never seen in me before. "I'm not going to yell at you," I said. "I don't think I have it in me, and honestly, I'm not sure yelling was ever going to fix the thing that's actually broken here." I picked my keys back up off the counter. "I'm going to stay at Marcus's place tonight. I'll figure out the rest tomorrow." "William, please, can we just—" "I heard you," I said at the door. "Every word. I just don't have anything else to say tonight." I didn't slam the door on my way out. I don't think I've ever slammed a door in my life. I got in my car, sat in the driveway for a full minute without turning the key, and looked back once at the kitchen window, where Elena was still standing exactly where I'd left her. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last time I'd see her cry in that kitchen. The next time I saw her, 3 days later, she wasn't crying at all, and what she told me then would recast almost everything I thought I already understood about how long this had really been going on. I stayed at my brother Marcus's place for 3 days before I went back. Not to talk about staying. Both of us understood that without needing to say it, but to start dividing up a house instead of living in it together. Elena was there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of her, and for the first time since that Thursday, she wasn't crying. "There's something else I have to tell you," she said, before I'd even taken my coat off. "You deserve to hear it from me instead of finding it some other way." I sat down across from her. I didn't say anything. I'd learned, in 3 days, that silence was still the thing I did best, but it felt different now. Less like avoidance, more like simply waiting to hear the rest of it. "It wasn't just since February," she said. "There was someone before Marco. A father from Owen's old preschool, 2 years ago. It didn't last long, a few months, and it wasn't like this." I told myself it didn't count the same way because it ended so fast. But I know now that's not really true. I think I've been looking for a version of myself outside this house for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. She pushed the legal pad an inch toward me, like she needed something to do with her hands. I opened the studio thinking it would be enough, having something that was mine, and for a while it was. But somewhere in there I stopped being able to tell the difference between wanting my own life and wanting to disappear from this one. I didn't say anything for a long moment. 2 years. A name I'd never hear. A preschool pickup line I'd probably stood in myself a dozen times without knowing what I was standing next to. "Why are you telling me this now?" I said finally. "It changes nothing about what happens next. Because you deserve to actually know what you're walking away from," she said. Not the version I could have kept editing down to something smaller. I nodded. I didn't forgive her in that kitchen, and I didn't need to, and I think we both understood that already. What happened after that was mostly paperwork, the unglamorous kind nobody puts in a story if they can help it. A mediator, a custody schedule that split the week evenly, a house that went up for sale within the month because neither of us particularly wanted to keep living inside the evidence. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near my office, close enough that Grace and Owen could walk to my place after school on the days that were mine. Elena kept the studio. She told me once, months later, in the flat, unemotional voice we'd both learned to use with each other by then, that Marco had stopped answering her calls within 2 weeks of it all becoming public. The studio's small community made sure of that, and that she hadn't heard from him since. I didn't ask her how that felt. I didn't need to. I started sleeping through the night again sometime that winter, which I hadn't realized I'd stopped doing until it started happening again. I noticed it the way you notice anything you'd quietly given up on. Not with celebration, just a kind of surprised relief, waking up on a Tuesday having actually rested. Grace asked me once, a few months into the new arrangement, whether I was happy. She's 11, old enough to ask questions like that, and mean them. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know yet, but that I'd stopped feeling like I was holding my breath all the time, and that seemed like the right direction to be moving in. I found her wedding ring once more, months after everything. Not on a bathroom counter this time, but in a small box of things Elena had left for me to sort through from a closet shelf. Things she said I could keep or throw away, whichever I wanted. I held it for a while, the way I had that first night, turning it once between my fingers. It didn't mean what it used to mean. It didn't need to mean anything at all, actually, and that turned out to be its own kind of freedom. The ring finally just being a ring, and nothing more. I've had some time to think about all of it since, and a few things have stayed with me more than the rest. Silence was never actually peace in our house. It just felt like peace, because it postponed the moment where I'd have to find out something I was afraid of. Noticing something and asking about it turned out to be 2 entirely different kinds of courage, and for most of my marriage, I only ever managed the first one. There was also that dance photo in the studio lobby, the one they'd swapped out without me really registering it for 6 months. Proof, if I'd needed any, that the truth is often hanging right at eye level long before you're ready to actually look at it. And underneath all of it, the thing I keep coming back to most. I spent 42 years being very good at not being the reason for a hard conversation. And it turns out avoiding hard conversations doesn't actually protect the people you love. It just delays the harder one. Have you ever caught someone in the middle of performing that everything's fine and known, even before you had the words for it, that something underneath was already gone? Thank you for staying with me through this one. If any part of it found its way close to your own life, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next story.